Hey, Sarah.
Yes, Alex?
It's a rainy Monday morning, and we both had insomnia last night, I think. What should we talk about?
How about death?
Okay, as long as we make it sexy.
Welcome to Mistakes Were Made, a podcast about non-monogamy for messy people like us. I'm Sarah. I'm a queer, non-monogamous therapist, parent, and writer, and I'm terrified of death.
Okay, me too. I'm her husband and co-host, Alex. Actually, I do not fear death at all. I'm ready.
I'm Jessica here producing. I'm here to find out whether I'm afraid of death or not. We're going to figure that out today.
Results
right?
pending.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. And we're here today with Kam, who is a trauma-informed spiritual care provider working in medical settings, as well as a gender doula. They hold a Master of Divinity and have worked in the past as a hospice chaplain. They're also a lover of French New Wave cinema, the salmon life cycle, and they once gave me a shoulder rub in jail when I was having a panic attack. Hi, Kam.
Hi. What an intro.
Welcome.
All those things are true.
They're all true. I'm so excited to have you here today. You and I have been talking about having you on the podcast and talking about death and grief and dating for like almost a year, maybe like 6 months.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
Still timely, more relevant now than ever.
Yep.
Very glad to have you. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
So when we schemed this up, one of the things that I thought was exciting about it is that people don't think about death and dating like ever kind of in the same sentence, or grief and desire. And I wanted to just start there. Like, why not? Why do you think those things feel so like separate and it seems strange to talk about them at the same time?
Well, I mean, I think your intro nailed it, Sarah. People are afraid of death. Yeah, they're afraid of talking about it. It's a really big topic. It's hard to make death sexy. Also, like, should we try to make death sexy? I don't know. Death often isn't sexy, right? And just in general, I mean, I think this comes up a lot, but we don't have a culture that has a practice of speaking about death, whether or not like in relationship or outside of relationship too. And so the vocabulary, the experience, right? It's kind of like most people I know don't experience it until they're really experiencing it, right? Or they don't talk about it until it's their only family member or their pet or, a horrific death on the news, right? That it's not something that's really built in, even though it's so a part of our lives, right? Like no one doesn't die.
I was thinking about that, like the universality of it, like, and how is there? I mean, I guess our culture is kind of conflicted in this way around the other things that come to mind are like birth, death, in some way like sex and desire. These are really universal parts of the human experience, and we have a hard time talking about them or talking about them unless it's like actively happening right now, and then you go somewhere where people talk about it.
Yep.
Right. And there's almost like cliches around it or sort of like fixed narratives that we're comfortable with kind of all those things, right? I'm just like imagining the way that like childbirth is depicted in movies and stuff like that. And it always is kind of like the same way. And I feel like probably the same thing for death. It's sort of like over there and it happens really quickly. And then we moved on to the next scene or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really big part of it. I think also the kind of, and this is really specific based on my experience being a spiritual care provider in hospital settings, is that kind of the Christian norms around death, right? Like there's the hope for miracles, there's the hope for healing, right? Like the medical, and then even kind of doctors, right? Like their priority is always to cure and to heal and to prolong life. Like that's I forget what it's called, the doctor code.
Like the Hippocratic Oath?
Yeah, something like I don't know. I should know what that's about. I'm not a doctor though, so fuck it.
I'm on the death side of things.
This thing, it's like we see it all the time where like someone will be moving towards end of life. They'll have a terminal diagnosis, but doctors will say, well, we can do this thing or we can do this thing, right? And this can give you this much more time. And then the way that people's kind of, even if they're not overtly explicitly Christian, that's really like Christian hegemony is so a part of our culture that I think in times of struggle or crisis, that's what people go to is they hope for healing. They hope for some miracle or some radical change. Like there's just so much resistance, right? To really embracing death kind of until the moment that it's happening. Yeah. Both for the people who are dying and for the people who are in their networks. So there's a lot of institutional and personal cultural forces that make it such a such a thing that we don't practice.
That's interesting that you would identify that as like a Christian value, because I just kind of like went through this with my father dying in a family that is not Christian, you know, I guess maybe sort of culturally, but certainly not like spiritually Christian in any way. And I thought of that as being almost like a barrier to acceptance, like the fact that there was no explanation of what was going to happen next. And then also like the alternative to religion, I guess, is often like science. And that's like science-based stuff does kind of also drive you to be like, well, there's going to be a solution to everything. We can like manufacture a scientific solution to everything to like deny this.
Totally.
So maybe it even goes beyond the religion piece.
Right. Well, and science likes to pretend that it's not like an ideology like religion or like a dogma, you know, but it has its own, and even science too has its own Christian origins often in this country too. So, it's regardless of your specific context or belief system or ideology, I think kind of across the board, it's rare.
Mm-hmm. And there is a distinction to be made around like spiritualism and like what kind of connection to like spiritual ideas and worldviews do you have outside of religion or not religion, which is often the way this like gets characterized. So I mean, maybe this is going too far, but I was like, what is it about Christianity that specifically feels driven by the idea of miracles and especially like end of life miracles, and it's almost Easter?
Yeah.
I was like,
there is that whole resurrection
is like the very center of the religion, which I hadn't made that connection before, but it feels like there's a link there.
Well, yeah, and you know, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Jesus performed all sorts of healing miracles, and so this thing of like, well, it's, and then you know, whatever. There's the biblical stories that then get kind of passed down and in certain very literalist traditions are taken to be very true events that happened. But then there's also, you know, the stories of someone who, there are like rare experiences of someone who was like in a coma and woke up, right? Or had a near-death experience and then survived, right? Like there are then these exceptions to the rule that I think this is larger, but it's like we're not very good at the gray area or the nuance, right? So if there's an exception, it's like, well, how did that happen? How do I also become an exception? Or that it's kind of like leaves that little tiny hope, door open for that hope of that then happening to yourself, you know?
Yeah. And then maybe that can make it feel like every death is a failure in some way because that didn't happen.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, in my line of work, like feelings of being abandoned by God because of illness, right? Of feeling like I am being punished for past sins, right? Again, in both for people who are explicitly Christian and for people who aren't, it's just that is the water that we're swimming in kind of dominant American society, right? Like those are the narratives. So yeah, it's heartbreaking. And that's a lot of the work that I do in the hospital is working with people around that kind of spiritual and existential distress, right?
How did you get into this type of work? I mean, given that most of us were raised in a culture where it was like, ignore this until you absolutely can't anymore. What drew you towards it?
Such a great question. And there's not like a short answer per se. I guess I'll share. So I'm from like a mixed faith background. My dad's side is Jewish. My mom's side is Greek Orthodox. But really very assimilated on both sides of my family, grew up secular. And then in my 20s, just, had a number of different experiences and deep relationships with people who had really profound spiritual practices. So whether that was tarot or like an ex of mine was adopted into a Mennonite family, and we like went to the LGBTQ Mennonite retreat, like, which was really precious. And I worked at this holistic health center where there were folks who practiced like a Haitian colleague was practiced voodoo. Like I had Buddhist practitioners and folks who practiced like all different kinds of healing traditions. And so I went to seminary being like, I want to help people. I think there's something really core about spirituality as helping people to sustain the activist work that they do, the movement work that they do that helps people really connect authentically. And went to seminary being like, I'm going to do like study community organizing from a faith-based perspective. I went to a seminary that has like a long and really rich tradition of anti-racism work and liberation theology. And then I got there and took Pastoral Care 101 and was like, wow, the queer curriculum is abysmal. And I happened to kind of medically transition that first year, like went on T and signed up for the first chaplaincy training unit that summer, kind of a full-time in a level 1 trauma center. And was just like, oh, like this is, I don't know. Yeah. In religious or spiritual circles, like this idea of like a calling, right? Like you feel called to particular work. It truly did feel like that. I think I'm someone who, because of personality, because of life experiences, is both really comfortable in crisis, but also really drawn to crisis and intensity, and feel really, comfortable in the hard, big emotions. And I'm not afraid of other people's pain. I'm not afraid of my own pain. Or I should say, like, I am, and I still go there, you know? And just the helping people be in those transitions has, there's just something that clicks to it. Again, that's a roundabout. I don't even know if I answered your question, Sarah, but that's some of what has drawn me into this work and kept me in this work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely hearing the connection to like movement work and what it felt like was needed there, and you being drawn to these exact corners that we're talking about, where it's like, don't look over there, don't go over there. This is, these are the corners that we're uncomfortable with. And you're like, what's happening over here? And I also hear inherent in that the connection to dating and partners and love, and how that also kind of was an entryway into some of this.
Totally. Yeah.
It makes me like curious about how you think about love and dating in reference to grief and death and spiritual like orientation towards life. How does that show up for you in your life now or more broadly?
Yeah. I mean, this podcast is called Mistakes Were Made. I've made so many mistakes in this area, Sarah. It's like one thing to like do work professionally and be really good at communicating and like really present and blah, 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 blah. And then it's my own life. And it's like, wow, I'm really withdrawn. Wow, I'm really shut down. Wow, I have no idea how to talk to people about it, right? It's hard. It's really hard. There's really, we can talk about grief and death in a really like, on so many different levels, right? The kind of really personal, like I am losing someone I love. I myself have a chronic or a terminal illness, right? We can talk about it on an ecological level, right? So even like right now we're in spring and there's so much life blooming, but then there's also the grief of like I'm a birder. And so I'm like so excited about all this bird activity, but then I'm also like, oh, but with the leaves, like it'll be so much harder to see them. Or like, there's like the light that used to filter through the trees in the forest, like will be covered. And there's grief in that, or grief in the loss of whatever, the change, right? We're always changing things. Or the oso berry, that the flowers that smell like cat piss, right? Like they're basically gone at this point unless I go to higher elevations. And it was such a small window and now they're gone. And isn't that so sad? It'll be a whole year, you know? Anyways, there's that level. There's, there's like political grief and death and all of these things. Like it's a part of our daily life. It's a part of that fabric. And so I think to be in relationship at all means to be in relationship to grief. Mm-hmm. There is no separation from that. It's, I think, a difference of how aware are you of that experience of loss, and how much do you allow yourself to feel it, and how much then do you allow it to be a mode for connection as opposed to kind of a vehicle for disconnection, which so often, at least in my personal experience, like grief can make my world a lot smaller, right? There's a withdrawing that happens. And that's certainly not everybody's experience, but I think it's a pretty common one. That there's, even when we were talking earlier about why is death so not talked about, part of it I think is just because it's a real natural tendency to kind of self-protect and to hide and to get small inside of it, right? To be afraid of being a burden, to be afraid of someone else letting you down in that really tender, fragile state, you know?
Right. The size of your own feelings, how taboo they are because of the very topic. Are you going to make people uncomfortable?
Yeah.
And then the kind of like self-imposed privacy of that is so strong. And as you were talking, I was realizing like about change, transition, and relationships. Also, as an aside, I always feel a lot of grief at the beginning of spring. I think there are a lot of death anniversaries in my life, especially in March, and that's part of the reason why. But as you were talking about the loss of the season, I realized that like the change from the winter, even if it's like a hard season, but it's the one I've grown accustomed to, it's the one like I've learned how to navigate, and then it's changing, and you can feel like the whole world changing with it. And there's some like fear and loss in that I always experience on that more like environmental level that I hadn't really considered before. Interesting. But I was going to say, as a relationship therapist, often people come to me in crisis in relationships because of some kind of loss or grief. I would say that that's like a really common catalyst for how people end up in my office, because it also really transforms you. And it's going to transform the relationships, or certainly impact the relationships that you're in because of the size of that experience.
Mm-hmm. How do you work with people when they come to you with loss and are experiencing, or what kind of, I guess I'm curious, like what kinds of ways do you notice your clients be impacted by grief in relationship? And then how do you work with them?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of what you were describing, that like identifying taboo, like identifying that these are spaces that we don't have experiences, like we don't have modeling for talking about. And so there's a lot of shame, and identifying that and kind of where it comes from, and building a container in a space where we can talk about those things safely and identify them as natural. I think it's really important. The relationship to change is huge. Like, I think Esther Perel famously said, in every single lifelong relationship, there are many relationships. And I think like often grief and loss inside a relationship will be a catalyst for a big change in that relationship. There's kind of like the before and after, and the recognition that we can embrace it. And it's not like we're going to get back to the place that we were before this loss happened, whether it was a loved one or a job or even like the grief of what a relationship was like before there was infidelity, for example. But that like we are moving through it and changing and finding something else, or sometimes not finding something else together. And, I think for me personally, and so this like shows up in a lot of my work, it's just always about building capacity for that gray.
Yeah.
For the change, for the gray. We don't have to live there all the time. It's okay to take comfort in absolute sometimes, but also recognizing that that is such an important tool for like being present to our lives and experiencing them fully. And actually, I think it offers us a lot of comfort, offers me a lot of comfort. Yeah.
The gray offers you comfort?
It does. Yeah. The reminder that like, even though we live in a culture, I was raised in a culture that really like believed in the dichotomies of like bad and good, right and wrong, success and failure, in community or shunned, they're just like very stark, crisp, kind of brutal lines in that way. And so I think like the remembering of the gray, that like most of life is experienced in the gray. That is actually what like the material of life is, is really helpful to me. And it makes me feel less isolated.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something, I think in the relationships, they are such a vehicle for growth, right? Especially because we don't tend to choose the things that we lose, right? Like death happens. People age, people get sick, seasons change, right? There's so much of it that is out of our control. But in contrast to the seasons where you're like, spring is roughly, March through June, and then summer is roughly here. And there's kind of a cyclical nature to that kind of loss. When you lose a person that you love, right? Or you're in a political era in which there's mass death, right? And there is no cyclical thing to it. There's no prediction. There's no like, okay, it'll be a year and then it'll be fine, right? I even think about this when we talk, this is a little bit of a pivot, but at least in the early months of Trump's presidency, this thing of, well, until the 2026 elections or until the next presidential, we got 4 years of this. And it's just like, well, we don't know, right? And I think that that's really a collapsing of that gray area, right? To say we really don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how long this grief is going to last.
Yeah.
We don't know when, so just an example of my, from my personal life, like I had a beloved cat who died last summer and had been kind of hooking up with or dating a few different people, and just like that switch went off, right? That dating switch, that sexual switch. I was just like, this grief is too big. There was also like, my aunt was going through treatments for cancer. My grandmother passed away. Like it was a lot, right? And this kind of like, I don't know when I'm going to want to date again. Like, I don't know when I'm going to have space for that, right? And just it's almost like the feeling of extended, like being on an abyss.
Yeah.
Or I think it can feel like that. And I know a lot of the folks who I work with in the hospital are so, like, I don't want to get stuck there. And it's hard to trust in that change or trust in that growth when it can be so big and uncertain about what that timeline looks like.
Yes. And I think you really like pressed into what is the scariest about grief and loss for me and a lot of people is like, what if we get stuck? What if this feeling is forever? And that feels so really like huge and oppressive.
Yeah, I remember when I was experiencing that, I guess it was around a breakup, but you told me a metaphor about a box and a button and a ball. And I found it actually, I think about it all the time, but then I've tried to repeat it to people and have sort of butchered it. So you should explain that if you can.
I'll see what I can do. So when they talk about grief, like one of the conceptualizations of it, and I'm not sure like which therapeutic modality came up with
Just
this.
take credit for it. Sarah made this thing up.
This is my idea. I'm coming up with it right now. And the idea is like if you imagined a box and there was like a big red button in it and a big red ball, and you set the ball like bouncing inside the box and it's hitting the button, and that's like the grief button. And it's just like, you know, often in the beginning or for periods of time, it's just hitting and hitting and hitting and hitting and hitting, and you have very little relief. And then like as you kind of integrate the experience and the experience changes, like the size of the ball and the size of the button do change. But the box never does. Like it's always there. And how often it might happen, or like if there's a period where it like happens more than another. But it is always changing. It is dynamic, even if like you don't ever leave the grief entirely behind. Or the loss.
I think I just found that helpful because it's not like it's both. It's not like you'll just get over it. But it is also like reassuring that it will change over time and perhaps, you know, become easier.
It's so funny how sometimes change is terrifying and sometimes change is comforting, right? And it's like if we feel like we have some control in a situation, change feels terrifying. If we feel out of control of a situation, the possibility for change feels comforting, you know? Or, you know, that's one way of maybe looking at it or thinking about it.
Yeah.
So you were mentioning that in your experience of loss, it felt like a switch flipped and you were like, didn't have any desire to date or be sexual at all. Has that been a common experience for you with grief? Do you find that that is what happens to people a lot? And then I want to hear like kind of from the table what people's experiences have been.
Yeah, I think that for me, that's definitely been a pattern. And, you know, I'm learning we're constantly, hopefully, learning and growing about how to care for ourselves better. Like, I think, a pattern is to really be black and white about it, of like, well, I don't have capacity to fuck, so I guess I can't date you anymore at all, right?
Right.
I know, just reflecting and preparing for this podcast, it's like, you really didn't have any gray space for what intimacy or like physical connection or intimate connection could have looked like that wasn't either sex or nothing, right?
Right.
But that has definitely been, been a tendency. I also know that I've had moments, and know other people have moments like in grief where they go the opposite and they're like, well, I'm just gonna like fuck the pain away, you know. It's quote Peaches. You know that song?
Yes, I do now. It's flooding back to me
Sucking
now.
on my titties like you wanted me, calling me all the time. Anyways, but that is like, and I think, that's also a tendency, right? And I think speaks to the intensity of the emotion, that it's often an extreme thing. It's like either withdrawing or like really leaning in. People who hold the, and in between, I think that's sort of rare.
It speaks to like the positive and maybe challenging connections of polyamory in this topic too, because it's like here you have this larger community theoretically of people who can like hold big feelings, and so it doesn't like create a lot of pressure on like one monogamous relationship. And also, I think kind of unfortunately, our polyamory is so defined by sex and romance that if you don't feel like you can access sex and romance, it feels like you can't access those relationships.
Yeah. Well, and just like being sexy is such a queer value too, right? It doesn't always have to be, and it's not for every queer community, but I think generally speaking, like, being hot, being like, a sexual being, right? Like that's a cultural value. And so, in times of like not doing that, like I know personally I've felt like, oh, like I've lost my collective queer value or my like social value, you know, which is both a story that I tell myself. I don't think it's actually true, but I do think that it can make times of grief and loss particularly hard to figure out how to then continue to exist in social, queer, poly spaces. And you're nodding emphatically, Alex.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how like sex and joy and like fun, they all kind of like go together in this way. And so if you're not feeling those things, yeah, it feels like you're not like delivering, perhaps. Yeah, I think for me, I don't know. There's been so much interesting stuff that you've talked about already. And just like even just awareness of grief as a thing, like I mean, it's like a pretty ever present emotion, if you want to call it that like I was realizing, I didn't really like think about it until like the pandemic was probably the first time that I was aware of like grief as something that was anything beyond what people experience when somebody dies in kind of this very simple kind of like binary way. And then like people started talking about like grieving the things that they couldn't do during the pandemic. And it makes sense. And then once you start seeing that, you probably start kind of seeing it and being aware of that feeling everywhere, including inside of relationships or relative to relationships that end. So I think with my experience with like, I've definitely had a lot of grief in the last year or so that sort of like started with a more traditional death of a parent, but then kind of extended to like relationships that like couldn't endure that basically. And like I had a couple of relationships like end kind of like in the wake of that. And like, and then the feelings of those things sort of compounded. And I found myself realizing like, oh, this grief that I'm feeling about this relationship ending is also sort of like, is definitely a compounded, or maybe like now I'm experiencing the grief of my father dying as well, even though that happened a few months ago, but like it kind of all landed. And I think some of that maybe is compounded also by like, yeah, who can be there for you or not. And for me, maybe just thinking about like, when you're not in a period of grief, you have the ability to show up in relationships as your sort of like best self or something, but maybe that's not even your real self. And then when you are in a moment like that, like, is it still worthwhile for the other person? Or do you project kind of like you're saying that, you're not enough for them unless you're being the fun person, that like happy person. And like, is this person want to be with you through this? And maybe that's like trickier in polyamory because, I guess speaking broadly, there's like not as much sort of like commitment, and say what you will about like traditional relationships, but they are very like, we already have like a cultural idea that like when your parent dies, your spouse sticks with you through that. Right. And
till death do us part.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sickness and health.
Yeah. It's like really there. And like, I don't know that we bring it there, or like it's up to us as individuals in individual relationships in polyamory to like have those values and those commitments. And maybe people don't really know how to do that. There's not like a playbook for it. Yeah. So that's my thoughts about that.
I just wanted to notice the ableism in that, which I've been thinking about a lot in this conversation. Just like, again, like grief, ableism has a much broader scope than I think I sometimes realize. And the assumption that we are only welcome in certain spaces if our spirit and our minds and our bodies are conforming in a very specific way.
So you were talking about like ability in how you show up in a relationship, for instance. Yeah.
Or thinking about like, a lot of people are like, I don't want to date someone who's actively grieving. I don't want to date when I'm actively grieving. That seems like a kind of inappropriate way to show up to that space. And I was just like, that is an assumption that I have just absorbed, but not really examined.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for, I think that's, naming the ableism part of it, right? It's, what are, various bodies have the capacity to do on any given day, right? The kind of physical, emotional, financial, etc. pain and suffering that any of us feel, right? It's those levels like really dramatically shift over the course of a life, and for some people more so than others. And I think it is, I appreciate, it seems like there's more and more naming of like chronic illness on dating profiles, for example, or yes, people's like various capacities or spoons available. Like I think that that's even in my own personal dating experience, like that kind of framework I think is has been much more normalized than when I was younger, right? But it's truly like a detriment to us all. Also because again, like we all will die. Like we all go through periods of relative disability, right? And needing support and connection and joy and love and intimacy through those things. And this kind of the norm of really not going there, right? There being talking about death, talking about illness, talking about bodies and all of their like mess and disorganization and disintegration, right? It harms us all in really tragic ways.
So do you think about your sort of role, I guess professionally almost, as like bringing those things forward?
Yeah, it really varies. It really varies. In my role, I mostly like see people one time. Occasionally I'll see people multiple times. When I was in hospice, it was really different, right? That was tending to build relationships with people over the span of weeks or months. But in a hospital setting, it's mostly one time. And I have, like, I'm not trying to diagnose anybody. I'm not trying to, like, get someone to take a test or, like, pass a test or whatever. And so I really meet people where they're at. And so if someone's in a place of, like, deep denial of those things, my job is just to be witness to that and to ideally help someone feel connected to what gives them purpose and meaning and value and comfort. So knowing that, like, I don't know what is best for somebody in that moment, right? Like, it's strange. It's really strange to be like, am I colluding in someone's denial? I don't know. Maybe. I can ask the questions. I can be there. I can reflect back what they're feeling. I can ask, what are the doctors? How does that match with what the doctors have said, you know? But it's not my job to force somebody to accept death, you know? My job is really just to be there and witness and connect, knowing that, like, I'm there for such a small slice of their journey. I will say my favorite visits are one in which we, like, totally go there and like get really into it. But that's few and far between.
Yeah. So your favorite visits aren't the one where a miracle happens and the person doesn't die after all.
Okay, I have this friend, a beloved friend who's also a chaplain, who said that miracles are a change in thinking. And I just love that, right? Because God damn it, it's so fucking hard to change our habits, right? Shit. It's so hard to, like, to get out of our ruts, get out of our stories. And in that way, those are fucking cool ass miracles to participate in or to help facilitate for people.
Have you seen that happen where somebody was really in a place of sort of like not accepting what was happening to them, and, you know, they were able to kind of turn that around with or without your intervention?
Yeah. And I'm trying to think of, like, a really concrete example that wouldn't violate HIPAA.
Yeah, you don't have to. We want names, dates.
Yeah, it's right. Social security number. Yeah. But no, I mean, I think there's, you know, that one person who comes to mind is, this kind of older man who was really involved in AA community for decades, was a sponsor to many people, and also LDS, Latter-day Saints. And I saw him 2 days in a row. He was had cancer, was at the end of his treatment options. On the first day I saw him, he was like, God is so good. God's with me. I've done so much good work. I've got such amazing community. Like, I'm not afraid to die. I'm, we'll see what happens, taking it day by day. Like, I'm good. I'm, chilling. Like, here's all these nice letters and phone calls I've had. And I'm like, great, that's awesome. Like, so glad to hear you're not feeling afraid, blah, blah, blah. But I get a message from the nurse the next day being like, hey, like, can you come and see this person again? I was like, yeah, what's up? Like, he was fine yesterday. Like, there's no spiritual distress. And he's like, well, something shifted. Like, he had a new conversation with doctors, and I think things are becoming more real. And I went, and the next day he was in tears. He was talking about his childhood. He was talking about his parents' childhood. He was talking about all of the sponsees who he wouldn't be able to be with anymore. He was still not afraid of death, right? But he was afraid of all the things that he wanted to still do in his life and wasn't going to be able to do, and was coming to that. And I'm like, is that a miracle? I don't know. I think in some ways it is, right? Like the miracle of allowing a heart to break open and allowing it to break open and to be witnessed and held in that. I think that's, in my experience, not inevitable, right? It's not inevitable that we allow ourselves the beauty of that, quite frankly. So.
Yeah. I mean, that just makes me think about how sometimes I feel like in general, the people who appear to be the most okay are maybe the least okay. Or like there are people like, this guy on day one who was like, everything is great. It's totally fine. I'm off to death with a smile on my face or whatever.
Going to heaven, and no problems here.
Yeah. And then, I guess like you're saying, is it better to just stay in that state? And honestly, this makes me think about, this comes up, I think, with sex a fair amount, with like, and polyamory, and especially like in swinging, like people who are like, I don't really experience jealousy with, my partners, like seeing my partners with other people, and in all these scenarios. And like, oftentimes I'm kind of like maybe it's just me, but oftentimes I'm kind of like, is that true? Or have you just like, are you just sort of denying yourself that like sort of acceptance of those feelings? So maybe those two things like feel very separate, but I kind of feel like they're.
Yeah. I mean, I think with this man I saw, I think he was genuinely okay one day and not okay on the other, right? I think that is because one has emotions that change doesn't mean that a prior emotion wasn't a real experience.
I was going to say, it reminds me of the gray thinking again, that lots of things can be true at once, and we can feel many things at the same time. And I think there is a lot of cultural pressure, whether it's around death or sex, to be all okay with something or not okay with it at all, right? And there is like a lot of
that's funny. I'm just like, guys, tell me which one's better.
And I guess I will also say too, it's like my job is so specific, and it's given me a lot of tools for being in interpersonal relationships, but it's really different when it's like a job versus a sweetheart.
I realized that the last 3 serious relationships that I've gotten into have all been a result of looking for people online to make out with in a bar in like while I'm like at the hospital, like at someone's deathbed. And they've resulted in like
so much cruising while I'm at work.
And I just realized I was like literally the last 3 relationships. It was just me being like, I don't want to be here right now. I'm just going to see if there's somebody who wants to take me out for a drink and make out with me. And then I was like, oh, dang, now I'm in a 2-year-long relationship.
So during the break, you were saying, we were like observing that there seem to be like a lot of people who are like queer and radical, maybe poly, who are like in the same line of work as you and chaplaincy or things like that. And like, do you think that that's a coincidence, or are there like whys behind that or intersections?
Yeah, you asked that question. I was like, yeah, ask me that on the podcast. And I'm like, wait, what are my thoughts on that?
Also, death doulas. I feel like the death doula world has a lot of that.
I think in general, it has to do with like being people who have experienced hardship, have experienced loss, have experienced transition, and have found ways to be resilient and find joy through that, right? But certainly not all queer or trans or poly people. Like in general, I think we're just as fucked up as anyone else in these areas. And like, I stand by that. I don't think being queer or trans or poly makes you any better equipped necessarily. And that said, I think that there's, it does really set us up well to be with people through those really hard times. And I also think that there's a real like creativity to my work too, a real like fluidity to it, an adaptability to it. Chaplaincy is kind of known as the ministry of presence. And I think, just like, there's a holisticness to being able to really be there and just be present to whatever someone is experiencing. That is, I think we're well suited to that work. And just asking questions too. I mean, one of the ways that like I worship the divine is by asking questions. And I think that that's also something that rad, queer, trans, poly, spiritual weirdos do, right? Is don't take things for granted. Don't take things as obvious. Get really curious about what's actually happening for this person. Those are some of my thoughts about that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And just like also being more sort of familiar with and accepting of that gray that we were talking about. And,
totally.
Yeah. Hard things happening. And
And you also mentioned the historical connection to collective grief, gay communities, queer communities, and how that informs some of this culture as well.
Yeah. There's, when we were talking earlier about different kind of layers of grief and loss, and you mentioned kind of COVID, Alex. Thinking about other periods of history in which there's been mass death, right? And thinking about like the AIDS epidemic, right, is one of those pieces. And I think often about this, David Wojnarowicz, who was a gay artist in New York City, who wrote in his book, Close to the Knives, I tried to look it up this morning and couldn't find it, but this invitation, like no matter what's happening, like make a drawing, like hang it up somewhere, like just any little thing to demonstrate publicly, collectively, that there is still life happening. There is still creation happening. Like we are still out here doing a thing, trying to make the world a more beautiful, rich, complicated, gray area place in the face of mass loss, in the face of institutions telling us to disconnect, to be afraid, to shut down. That there's a real historical lineage, I think, connection both to the deep pain of that, the deep pain of being a part of a historical community that has experienced so much discrimination and violence, and also a real tapping into what it means to survive what it means to find joy and abundance and pleasure through those experiences. And being queer is just one community of many, many marginalized people across time who have done exactly that. Sadia Hartman's book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, kind of looks at this too from the position of stories of Black folks' intimacy and connections. And she's a historian looking at this kind of through archives and the traces of lives and the ways that people found really queer connection, though they wouldn't necessarily identify as queer, right? But these ways of doing that despite overwhelming state violence, right? It's both a source of deep pain and overwhelm and power too.
Yeah. As you were talking about that, a really early experience of mine as a young journalist floated back to me. I worked at a now defunct online paper called the Gotham Gazette, and I was given the assignment to go interview, it was entirely gay men in a new nursing home, specifically for gay men in New York City. And I remember talking to one of the men I interviewed there, and I was asking I was very young, in my early 20s, and asking some questions about like being at end of life. I think I was kind of like looking for survivor's guilt probably in my questions, or maybe that was like part of the angle. I think there might have been a program around it. And I remember him saying something like, well, I have been aware of the end of my life since the beginning of my life. And that has always been the way I've been living because of my experience in the AIDS epidemic and the people I lost, and the always living with the knowledge that I too might go at any time. So my relationship to this part of my life is just a continuation of how I've experienced it. And it really, like, I think at the time was almost bigger than I could kind of take in. But it came back to me now.
Yeah.
That same idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that like collective deep breath, I think, is something that, I don't know, just noticing that's probably makes for bad podcasting, but also makes for real connection, right? This shit's heavy.
It is.
It's heavy.
Yeah.
And to be able to stop and pause and sigh is really important. It's a skill.
And to feel it together, to know that we are like in communion with that feeling.
Yeah.
Important.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about desire and sex in the context of death. And I'm wondering how do people feel about transitioning to that? Talking about it a little bit. Because Cam, you mentioned that there can also be like lots of sex and desire at end of life. And I think that feels like the ultimate compounding of the taboos that we're talking about here.
Totally.
And I'm wondering if you'd be up for, telling us a little about it.
There's this beautiful book of poetry by Donald Hall, whose wife was Jane Kenyon. They're both poets. And the book is called Without. And there's a series of poems at the end of this book called Last Days. And in one of the sequences, she was dying of cancer. And in one of the poems, she just kind of suddenly, they're talking about these good memories and things that they've done. And at the end of this like poem, she just goes, no more fucking, right? This like realization that was a big part of their relationship. That was love. That was something that they enjoyed. And just being like, God, like when I'm dead, I'm not going to be able to fuck anymore, right? I'm not going to be able to fuck you anymore. And in the last poem, right, like there's this, she's lost her speech, she's lost everything. She's kind of minutes from death and is able to purse her lips for one last kiss, which is just like heartbreaking and so beautiful. And just to kind of, so some anecdotes, right, that speak to that. And then I want to say, so this patient that I had, I was privileged to be there when he passed, and his wife invited me to help wash the body, which tends to be something that the hospice nurses do. Family members don't tend to want to do that. But again, like his wife was like, I love his body. I want to be able to wash his body and prepare and take care of it and touch his like genitals, because that's my domain, like it was really like, I want to be able to do that. But I kind of helped do that process. And that was the first time washing a body. And again, it was people that I really loved. And the person that I was dating at that time, again, my pattern, right, would have been to withdraw. Like that was really intense. That was really sad. I'm just going to go home and cuddle my cat and cry on my own or whatever, write my own bad poetry about it. But I instead, with the person that I was dating, I just remember I was like, I'm really emotional. And they were like, come on over. And I was like, I just want to be held. And they were like, okay, I can do that. It was maybe a few months into dating them. Like it wasn't like we were committed in any sort of long-term way at that point. And we just lied in bed and I let myself be held and cry. And it's so simple and yet so hard. But I think that that's an example and what I hope to move more towards in my life, and perhaps for other people, figuring out like what is that desire for connection, or what kind of connection is possible that might not be sex, might not be kissing, might not be sexy, but is still a way of allowing one's body to be cared for and be held and tenderly and preciously. And I think that's one of the things that death does, right, is teaches us the preciousness of the body, right?
Yeah.
That's very moving. I feel like I'm going to cry.
There's like so much there that's bringing me back to the distinction between sort of like the way that we think about sex as performance and the ableism, like when can you kind of do that the best and like show up in a way that is like in the most sort of like performative service to your partners, and like the vast distinction between that and like the actual like sort of lasting connection that people have, that I guess is like more highlighted, when like they're near to death, or just like, but probably kind of through like vast parts of our lives, right? Where we're not like, we tend to, I think, kind of idolize or idealize these parts of our lives and ourselves when we are like at our best in some way, and at the expense of like appreciating the connection that we can have when we aren't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I want to be as whole and full of a person as much of my life as I can be. Mm-hmm. And that means finding people who can go there with me. And that means letting go of people and relationships who can't meet me there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that like, there's, I don't know, I think there's a lot more going on. I happen to know from information recently around my parents aging and death that like they had a lot more going on in this realm in their later years than I ever would have kind of like expected. And I think this is probably common for when people are dying, a lot of that stuff to come out, because everybody who cares about them or cared about them intensely is going to like, show up in some way or another, or at least be like affected by it. I think it was really surprising for me to kind of see how many such people there were, and like, and yeah, just kind of like how I don't know if I want to say for better or worse, but how much life there was being lived in these realms that like it doesn't just like end when you whatever turn 45 next year.
Well, and just the aliveness that is inherent in thinking about grief and death and life. This is all a part of life. This is not like a segmented away, not part of life territory. Yeah. It is all part of life, and the mingling of desire and love and connection and fear and, grief. It's all so close. And when we were preparing for this, I had the realization that my last 3 most serious relationships have all come out of getting on the dating apps when I was like in the hospital with your dad as he was dying, or in the wake of our friend Bryce's death. And just being like, I want to go out and like be alive with somebody. And it wasn't like to negate the feelings of like grief and loss. It was because they actually were heightening my sense of aliveness. I was like, I have like a ton of feeling alive. Mm-hmm. And that like felt like this natural way to express it. And then interesting to notice that like long, loving relationships emerged from that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, Sarah. Yeah, the sluttiness that can emerge from deep sad grief. Wow. And yeah, there's no right or wrong way to do any of it. And I think to whatever degree we can, to suspend the judgment that we have for whatever those desires or impulses are when experiencing loss and grief, right? The better. Because I think that there's probably people who might have been in your shoes who had been like, I want to go on the dating apps right now, but that would be fucked up. Like, what would that mean about me that I just want to go make out with somebody, And maybe you felt some internalized judgment or shame around that, but you did it anyway. And you allowed yourself to be in that experience in its full range of intensity, right? And again, it's like what for any given person, what's going to foster connection right now? Mm-hmm. Even if what's fostering connection is the need for time away and not connecting, right? Like, I know that, again, like my pattern tends to be withdrawal, and I know that for me often to be counter to what I want or what is going to be most healing for me. And for other people, like that same behavior is exactly what they need, right? And so there's no one size fits all for grief, and we're constantly changing in what our relationship to that, our own grief is, right? I think you mentioned the Esther Perel quote at the top, right? Of like something about
every relationship has many relationships inside of it.
Yeah. The same goes for our own, needs and desires inside of moments of transition, and just allowing that to be true from moment to moment.
Yeah. And I'm appreciating, again, the larger collective moment we're having this conversation in, and how that too, it's just a moment of big loss, big grief, big uncertainty, also big aliveness, big desire for connection, and for meaning at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How is the political moment for you been impacting your relationships and your desire, Sarah or Alex?
Yeah, I think I have felt this conversation is really helping me, that I have felt like they were in kind of conflict with each other. I think that I'm like, I got time for dating, or I've got time for the revolution, but I can't date and do the revolution at the same time and raise kids and be a therapist and and it's interesting to me that I've pitted these two parts of my life against each other. And I don't know that I have like a conclusion about it, but it just like keeps coming back to me as we're talking that my urgency, my feelings of urgency around the political moment and like wanting to like rise to it in community, in meaningful and effective ways, it's like I have told myself, and I think there might be some Christian thinking in this, where I'm like, you can't do that and also pursue love and pursue sex and maintain these like complex webs of like romantic polyamorous relationships. Like, you have to choose. And I'm just like, that's very black and white thinking. I'm like, why am I doing that? Like, why have I told myself that I have to choose between this type of love and connection and this collective type of love and connection? And I think that shows up for me a lot, where I'm like, I will kind of default to the collective, and that's where I feel more open and less afraid. And so I'm like, that's where I will go in moments of distress or confusion. And then I tend to shut down in the intimate romantic relationships because that's where I feel less confident. I feel more scared. And yeah. So.
But like intimate relationships are an entry point into the collective too, or they can be.
They can be, yeah.
And like, how do you know? I mean, like, there's no faster way to find out if you have like material of like trust and like generative energy with somebody than to like, it doesn't have to be that way, but you know, having a romantic relationship or meeting somebody in that realm does help you like understand that very quickly. And I feel like my experience has kind of been this is definitely something that I guess we've both been talking about and thinking about. And like, to the extent that I've just been like coming in hot on dating apps, asking people this question, like, what do you think about, can,
what's the question? What are you asking?
Can, polyamory or like romantic relationships, are they like politically revolutionary or generative, or are they like a distraction from that? And
revolutionary or counter-revolutionary?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. It's probably a good litmus test for people if they're like there with me to like interrogate whether something is revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. It's a good starting point, even though it's like, you know, kind of a silly binary, but like it is a question. What do you think?
Oh my God. Well, I mean, I think there's nothing inherent. I don't know if this is a hot take, but I don't think there's anything inherently revolutionary about being queer or about having sex or about grief, right? Those things can be vehicles that generate collective action, that generate collective care, that generate communities of people building systems outside of, you know, capitalist heteropatriarchy, blah, 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 blah. Or as my therapist would say, meow, meow, meow. But they don't have to, right? There's nothing, none of this happens by default. And I think that can be sometimes a trap that I know I have fallen into, and I think many other people have fallen into, right? That an identity necessarily means a particular kind of action taken in personal or political contexts. And so being really honest about that, I think, is painful and hard, but helpful.
Yeah, that's really well put.
Yeah. Is there anything else we want to talk about? Mention?
Well, I have something.
Oh, okay, Kim.
This is really me ending on a strong Leo note. When we were first texting about me being on the podcast, I was like, can it low-key be an advertisement that I'm single?
Wow.
And I guess I just want to say that as heavy as this shit can go, like, being someone who really can embrace the hard things means that the lightness and the levity and the joy and the fucking wonder is like that flip side of the coin, right? I tell this to my patients all the time who are really like experiencing the death of a loved one, and they're like, I don't want to cry about it. They wouldn't want me to be sad about it. I don't want to remember. I'm like, well, you loved this person for like so many years, or like in all these intense ways, of course, right? Like the grief that you feel is commensurate with the love that you felt, right? And I think that there's, for people who might feel daunted by the prospect of having to get in touch with these really big feelings, I just want to say, like, there is so much aliveness, so much, like openness to surprise, to beauty, to the unexpected, in like the most delightful ways that can come when you're somebody who also allows yourself to go to the hard places. So I want to say that.
You're like, so date me. I have an ex-therapist, a former therapist who used to say, the shadow is dark because the sun is bright.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like I'm worried about how much response you're going to get to this.
Me too.
You might want to like state some criteria.
Y'all can work it out. You can be my screeners.
Okay, cool.
I trust Sarah.
Great.
And I can honestly say that having known Cam for the past year, there's been like some dark shadow and some really bright sun. And it really is, it's all of those things at once. And it is truly wonderful. And if anyone scores a date with you out of this, it is their good fortune.
I do actually feel like having listened to all of this conversation is like it's a good screening process
That
already.
is
If anybody
true.
got
That
this
is
far
true,
through
yeah.
all of this, then I mean, it was a
Yes.
great conversation, but very like heavy. You know, you got your like intense people who want to engage with this. So
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
I'm blushing now.
yeah, perfect.
And it's cute for anyone out there who's interested.
Email us for pics. The email address is mistakescast@gmail.com. Thank
my
you for listening. We've actually been getting some great listener feedback recently, so hopefully people will keep it coming. You can also find us on Instagram @mistakescast. And thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much, Cam, for being on here and having this conversation with us.
Yeah, thank you all. It's so rare to have an opportunity to bring both my chaplain self and my queer slut self to the same table, and it's just such a joy. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, bye everybody.